Welcome. I'm Dr. Harold Eberly, and this is a brief overview of Volume 5 in the 12-volume series of a book I authored entitled Father-Son Theology. Volume 5 is entitled The Value and Moral Nature of Humanity. We'll be talking about how good or bad are people and what causes them to be good or bad. This has profound implications on our theology, understanding that we are gathering from Scripture, and I hope to share and communicate with you what a biblical understanding of the value and moral nature of humanity is. Now, each volume builds on the information from preceding volumes. So I'm going to put up the first slide, which I can use to help review, at least give us a picture of where we have arrived so far. Now, this slide, I hope it brings to your remembrance. We have a timeline. Above the timeline, we're talking about biblical Christianity. Below the timeline, we're talking about classical theology, classical Christianity. The word classical comes from the period in ancient times when the Greek and Roman empires were ruling around the Mediterranean Sea. During that time, Christianity is born, comes into the Roman Empire, and the classical view of God is developed during that time. We have thoroughly discussed this, but taking another snapshot, below the line, you'll notice Plato has a little snapshot of what he contributed, and we discussed that. This dualistic cosmology, two worlds. There's a spiritual world and a natural world. Of course, he contributed many other things, but we're pointing out the things that are important for our discussion. Following Plato, Aristotle comes along and reasons that something from the uncreated spiritual world must have pushed the natural world into motion. So he called that the unmovable mover. He labeled the spiritual world as timeless. Then we come to Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism, New Plato, Plato's teachings. He reworks Plato's thinking. He calls the being within the spiritual realm the One, and pictures him radiating his attributes like the sun radiates light. And he adds certain characteristics, attributes that he assigns to that God. In particular, not only does he radiate his attributes, but he is simple. And we explain that simple, when talking in this context, is not the opposite of difficult or complex. Simple is the opposite of composite. God has no parts. He's not made up of parts that you can separate from him, but all of God is where God is. So that is the foundation that was laid long before Christianity developed. Now, Plotinus was after Jesus, but the foundation came from the ancient Greek philosophers, and that was the worldview of the intellectuals in the Roman Empire at the time Jesus came into the world. So when Christians come out of Judea, they're coming into this Roman world, and they're communicating with the people who are aware of what the intellectuals are teaching. So we have developed that, and then above the line, we contrasted that a biblical cosmology, that is our understanding of the world, comes from Genesis 1:1. God only created one world, not two worlds. There's one world, and in that one world are the heavens and the earth. And we also explained how God fills the heavens and the earth with a biblical cosmology. Now, how we understand the Bible is very much determined by which foundation we're building on. Both the top and the bottom, Christians believe the Bible. They're reading the Bible, but they're putting the information on a foundation that profoundly influences how they understand the Bible. Specific verses that actually are influenced your understanding, your interpretation, depending on which foundation you're building. And I am hoping that Western Christians like myself can build on a different foundation, not the one laid at the foundation of Western civilization, but the one that is biblically derived. So that's what we're doing throughout all of Father-Son theology. This time, we're focusing on the value and moral nature of humanity. And in each of these discussions, it's just a brief overview. We're touching less than 20% of the material in the textbook, Father-Son theology, but now we're going to take the step into this understanding because it determines how we understand human nature. We're going to take the little snapshot of Plotinus's view of God, where Plotinus says there's a one radiating his attributes. The reason we're going to build on that is because Augustine built on that. And Augustine, especially in the 400s, was building on this, and he was at a key time in the history of Christianity, the church, and he brought into thought a concept of God built on that foundation, Plotinus's. And we explained how Augustine was a student of Plotinus's teachings before he became a Christian. So now I'm putting up this slide, the second slide, which shows Plotinus and Augustine. I have taken that one snapshot. Now, it's a little bit expanded up and down vertically, stretched out so you can see the radiating attributes. But this is the concept that Plotinus offered and Augustine embraced. Now, there are details about this that Augustine did not embrace. But what you see in the diagram are the things that Augustine did embrace. This is how he understood God and his cosmology when he was reading the Bible. And we explained preceding all that entails. Now, this is a diagram. Some people think in terms of diagrams. Others think in terms of words. People are verbal learners, or they learn in pictures. That's what forms in their mind as they're learning things. So this is a diagram, but many of you would benefit more if I simply talked in words that didn't have diagrams. And if that's you, I hope you can listen to my words more than focus on these diagrams. But if you're a diagram learner, picture learner, then these will help, okay? So you could develop this image, whether it's words or whether it's diagram. This is how the thinking was with Augustine embracing Plotinus's thoughts. Now I'm going to show you the next slide, because we're going to develop step by step how Augustine came to understand good and evil, if God is good, then everything he created must be good. That's what's shown in this diagram. This slide shows a good God. Radiating out of him has to be good. Therefore, what he creates has to be good. So Augustine is simply thinking philosophically, trying to understand where did the good world come from and where does evil come from. So first he concludes God can only create good if he's good. So sounds okay, but let's take the next step. So now he's considering, then where does evil come from? And Augustine concluded first God created everything. Know that from Scripture. So he said evil must not be a thing, because God can't create evil in his thinking. So evil must not be a thing. So he's trying to understand, if it's not a thing, what is evil? And his definition of evil was the absence of good or the bending of God's will. You can define in Augustine's thoughts either way, that God's will was radiating from him, but it got bent. And that bending is altering God's good will, and now it becomes bad or evil. So we show in this little diagram how the rays coming from God are bent, and that's how they become evil from that point on, and evil comes into the world and into humanity because somehow it got bent. We could also say the absence of good. The absence, the good was removed, and what remained was the evil. But primarily his thinking was centered around the bending of God's will. That's what this diagram represents. You can see where God's will got bent right there, and everything below the line, below the bent lines, is now evil. Now, the next diagram, we're going to put Adam and Eve into this picture. We're still looking at the bending of God's will. God radiates his good will, but it gets bent, then it becomes evil. But now we're positioning Adam and Eve as the instruments who bent God's will. That God meant good, but his will got bent through Adam and Eve, and that bent will goes into all Adam and Eve's descendants. Now, Augustine develops this much quicker. I mean, what I'm explaining in just this brief overview, there's a whole lot. There's volumes and volumes and volumes written about these concepts. So please, I hope if you're interested, you take the time. There's all kinds of footnotes and quotes in the text. But right here, This helps us understand Augustine's thinking. Notice everything below Adam and Eve is bent. All the people are bent, meaning their nature is corrupted. This is how Augustine said evil originated. I have a couple below quotes from Augustine, and he said, "For nothing else could be born in them, that is the descendants of Adam, than that which they themselves had been." So he's trying to explain why are the descendants of Adam and Eve evil? Because nothing else could be born in them than that which they had been. What was in Adam and Eve, the evil, produced evil descendants. Another one, man beget corrupted and condemned children. So now this extends in Augustine's mind not just to adults, but children, that babies are born bent. Babies are born evil. Now, you'll remember that Augustine is the most influential theologian of the 5th century and profoundly put Christianity on another path where there was a lot of different understandings before Augustine. But Augustine was so influential, he kind of brought together the thinking of many preceding teachers, how they understood Scripture, and he became a focal point. And the Roman Catholic Church embraced Augustine's teaching on many issues, such as this. This became the foundation for Roman Catholicism's thoughts about how babies are born with Adam's sin, and therefore there must be water baptism of babies to free them of that sin. So this became a foundation when the Roman Catholic Church then in the 5th century and 6th century, it becomes common practice to water baptize babies because if babies are born evil, we need to water baptize them. So there's profound influence on all of this. But not only Augustine, you remember that both Luther and Calvin were building their theology on Augustinian thought. Luther and Calvin built on this concept that evil is the bending of God's will or the absence of good. So they have a similar diagram in their minds when they're reading the Bible. Next, I would now like to put two side by side. We have on one side Adam and everything bent after Adam. Because Adam is the head of this thing, the term federalism is used. This is a term used in theology, different than used in politics or government. But in theology, federalism refers to a head who represents everyone under him. Adam represents all of humanity. And what that head does influences all of humanity. Alongside it, we put Jesus Christ. He is also a federal head in federalism. And so what he did extends to all who believe in him. The concept of federalism is simply that a federal head, Adam's a federal head, Jesus is a federal head. A federal head did something that influences everyone descending from them. So I put them side by side. We're not going to talk right now about what Jesus did. We talk about salvation and all Jesus did in volume 7 when we talk about soteriology, which is the study of salvation. Right now, I simply wanted you to see them side by side, even though we're focusing on what Adam did. To see them side by side, I can introduce the term federalism. As Adam is a federal head, so also is Jesus a federal head. This lesson, we're teaching about Adam and how that influenced all of humanity's moral nature. Are they good or bad? So Augustine has these two parallels between Adam and Jesus, and his theology is built on this. So now we're going to go back to the one picture of Augustine. And here, what I'd like you to notice is that Augustine had to answer the question, how does Adam's sin go into humanity? It wasn't enough to just say federalism, because that's a word, but it doesn't explain how is it that the sin is transmitted into Adam and Eve's descendants. So I put on this diagram three avenues, ways in which sin proposed by Augustine could be passed on to Adam's descendants. He proposed three different explanations. These explanations are still common today in Western Christianity. You've probably heard all three of them, and I'm just going to briefly mention the three. First, notice the arrows pointing down, and that represents the three ways Augustine proposed to explain how sin moved from Adam into his descendants. The first arrow I have written on it, covenant. That's a word that will help me explain Augustine's first explanation. Next arrow has the word sex, which will help me explain Augustine's second explanation. And then in Adam, those two words will help me explain Augustine's third explanation. So three explanations he gives. Real briefly, we'll look at each of these. So first, we're going to look at covenant, the first arrow. And so I'm putting up a diagram so you can be with me on this. Yeah, covenant. Okay, how is it that Augustine explained a covenant is why Adam's sin went to his descendants? Well, I put Genesis 2:16, 17 down here, and Augustine had a certain interpretation of this. I'll read it. From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For the day that you eat from it, you will certainly die. Now, Augustine took that passage and he said, when God told Adam and Eve, the day you eat of it, you will die, he was making a covenant with them. And because a covenant has implications for one's descendants, you can compare it to a marriage covenant. A marriage covenant influences all of the husband and wife's descendants. Compare a covenant to a treaty. A nation, the leader of a nation might make a treaty with another nation. Well, that's going to influence the entire nation. Well, a covenant has a similar effect upon everyone. So when Adam made a covenant, it influenced all below him. When he made a covenant, in particular, Augustine understood that he would break the covenant if he ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore the consequence would all of humanity. So that's Augustine's first explanation of how sin passed from Adam to all of his descendants. There was a covenant. Now, people like me would respond and say there's nothing in this passage nor anywhere in the Bible that talks about God making a covenant with Adam. See, a covenant was a very serious commitment. That's what we see God making with Noah and Abraham and David. And every covenant, through Jesus, also a covenant, through every covenant, there were acts to demonstrate that it happened. We're told it's a covenant. There are signs of a covenant. For example, Noah has the rainbow. Abraham has circumcision. There are signs, symbols to mark it. There is nothing in Scripture that tells us a covenant was made here. Now, with covenants, among the Hebrew people, there was the shedding of blood. There was significant sacrifices being made. There was no shedding of blood when God made this statement to Adam and Eve. To someone who just reads this, they will conclude that God gave a warning to them and a command. Don't eat from the tree, a command and a warning. The idea that it's a covenant was necessary for Augustine to try to figure out how can sin be passed. And people like me point out there's no evidence that it's a covenant. There's one verse in Hosea chapter 6. In Hosea chapter 6, there's it depends on how it's translated. Like the New American Standard talks about like a statement like Adam, they broke their covenant. Like Adam, they broke their covenant, referring to the people of that time. When Hosea was alive, the prophet Hosea, like Adam, they broke the covenant. Okay, that's the only passage in Scripture that refers to an Adamic Adam covenant. However, we need to be careful because the name Adam is also translated as humanity. Therefore, when the King James translates Hosea chapter 6, verse 7, it says, and like humanity, they broke a covenant. See, just because one translation says in Adam doesn't mean that is the proper translation. That's the only place in the Bible where any covenant is associated with Adam. Now, we know blood was shed after Adam sinned. When God made these animal skin coverings, there was probably bloodshed, but that was after they sinned. They couldn't have broken a covenant if the covenant was made after they sinned. No, sin has to happen. Eating of the tree would have to happen before. I mean, eating the tree would have to after the covenant, but the shedding of blood happened after they'd already sinned. So they weren't breaking any covenant at that time. In Hosea chapter 6, there's no other passage talking about Adam. It's talking about humanity. And so the point people like me who study this, point out, Augustine, you really wanted to find a covenant in that passage in Genesis chapter 2, but there is no mention of it, nor is there any ceremony of establishing a covenant, nor signs of a covenant. So we would say that's not a good argument for explaining why Adam's sin went to all of his descendants. Let's go to Augustine's second explanation. So now I've got the arrow descending from sin into humanity, but I put the word sex on there. See, this is Augustine's second explanation, proposed explanation. Augustine had a very negative view of sex, even within marriage. Now, he had lived a very sexually promiscuous life in his early years. When he grew up and became a Christian, we have no evidence that he was sexually promiscuous. But his idea of sex, it was an out-of-control thing. He used the word concupiscence. Now, this word at that time, and even today it's being used in theology, to represent the act of sex when it's so intense that a person loses rational thought. They lose their reasoning ability for a moment in time, and the loss of reasoning ability is when sin happens. In that moment of concupiscence, the desire is so strong that rational thought is gone. Augustine, that is when sin is passed from parents to children and all the descendants. So every time parents have sexual relationships, it's an opportunity for the Adam sin to be passed. Now, this became the common explanation in Christianity during the Middle Ages. The Roman Catholic Church embraced it in the Lateran Council and included, even today, it's still within Roman Catholic theology. That's the act of sex. And that influences some things that they think about sex even today. Protestants, although this concept influences Protestant thought, Protestants have a more positive view of sexual relationships, that it's something God created to be enjoyed in the marriage relationships. However, sex is still under suspicion, but in Catholicism, it's not just under suspicion, it's still thought of as at the very core of human nature, that people are corrupt, but they also have this uncontrollable sexual urge that gets out of control at times. So Augustine proposes sex is it. And the thing that proves this wrong is what's known as in vitro fertilization. See, today in modern medicine, there's a practice where sometimes babies are conceived with no sexual desire involved. There can be extracted from the woman an egg, extracted from the man a sperm, and the egg can be fertilized in a test tube where there's no sexual desire. Okay, well, if Augustine was correct that sex and concupiscence was the avenue through which sin is passed, well, then any baby conceived in the test tube, in vitro fertilization, without any passion, would be born without original sin. Okay, original sin is what we're talking about being passed. Original sin refers to the sin Adam committed, but that sin, the original sin, is passed into all of humanity. So original sin refers to, in classical theology, what every baby is born with. So this concept of sex being the avenue through which it's passed on has been proven wrong by the modern practice of in vitro fertilization. No one thinking reasonably would say that babies born of in vitro are born without original sin, where those born with sexual actions are born with sin. I mean, we can't embrace that. Yet, if we face reality that this is happening, we have to abandon the concept that sex is the avenue through which it's passed. Okay, I said Augustine proposed 3, but I wrote one more verse at the bottom of this. Augustine tried to support this concept that sin is the avenue through which original sin is passed. And he quotes King David where King David in Psalm 51, verse 5 says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." Augustine takes this and says every human being is conceived in sin, that the act of conception, the sexual act, is what results in us being born in iniquity. Now, you probably have heard that because it is so commonly how we understand in Western Christianity Psalm 51, verse 5. Now, I would like to propose a different understanding, and actually what I'm going to propose to you is how many of the Jewish people understood that verse. You see, among the Jewish people, it is commonly known, at least in a large percentage of Jewish people, that David was born as an act of adultery, that he was conceived in sin. His father Jesse had committed adultery, and he was the illegitimate son. Now, we have evidence of this. For example, he was the shepherd boy. The shepherd boy was the excluded, the one who was looked down upon. They could not live with the family. They could not get an education. They were excluded from the family involvement. So another reason that we see confirmation in the scriptures for that David was born of an act of adultery, you remember when Samuel came to the home of Jesse. Samuel was the prophet. He came to anoint one of Jesse's children, one of his sons, as to be the next king. And that was a practice common at that time. Prophets were used to anoint people. Well, Samuel came and he asked, "Bring all your sons." And Jesse brought all except David. He didn't even bring David. David was the illegitimate shepherd boy. But Samuel had to ask, "No, you have one more son. Who is he?" And then they brought David. So in the rabbinical writings, first of the first century, there's references to David being born as an illegitimate son. And this was a major issue because David lived under that concept of being illegitimate, but David was a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ in some ways. David was going to be the king of the natural kingdom in Judea, where Jesus is a king of a new kingdom, but he lived under the shadow of being illegitimate. I mean, people around would have known. They can count the months that he was conceived before the wedding took place. So here, when we're looking at this second reason, sex, we have to discount it. It's not true. In vitro fertilization proves it wrong, but this verse that's been used to support the idea is understood completely differently. David was conceived in iniquity and sin. It's wrong to take a verse in which David was talking about his own conception and apply it to every human being throughout all of history. That doesn't make much sense. Yet that's what Western Christianity has done because Augustine proposed it. Now let's go to the third explanation Augustine proposed for how the sin of Adam comes into all of his descendants. He uses Romans 5:12. You're perhaps familiar with this. I'll read the verse. This is from New American Standard Version. "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all mankind because all sinned." So it's, common knowledge, people embrace that the one man sinned is Adam in this verse. That Paul is explaining that through Adam, sin entered into the world, then death through sin, and so death spread to all mankind. Now, that sin entering the world, in Augustine's mind, that sin through Adam came into the world, it came into the inherited nature of humanity. So the word world is thought of as sin came into the inherited nature, all the descendants of Adam. And then what's also important that added to Augustine's thinking about this is he didn't have this translation, which is very accurate to the original Greek. Down below, I explain, below the diagram, Augustine used the Latin translation of the Bible called the Latin Vulgate. Augustine, someone who knew named Jerome, translated from the original Greek manuscripts that were available at that time, the Latin translation. That Latin translation became the standard for Roman Catholicism for the next 1,000 years, the Latin Vulgate. Well, the Latin Vulgate mistranslates this verse. It's the last three words. See, in Romans 5:12, last word, because all sinned. This is important, because all sinned, because it's mistranslated, those three words, and I put the Latin down below the diagram, in quo omnes peccaverunt, and that's translated as, into English, this means in whom all sinned. So, does sin and death spread to people because they were in Adam, as Augustine taught, or because they all sinned? There is. Well, we know today that Augustine had a mistranslation. The idea that we were in Adam when he sinned. That's what Augustine concluded, that we were in Adam, but his mistranslation of that verse led him to conclude that way back in the beginning when Adam was alive, when he sinned, we were in him. We were in his DNA. Therefore, we sinned with him. As he sinned, we sinned. Therefore, we are guilty. And we have that original sin in us, and every baby does. But that is a mistranslation. Here, if you read Romans 5:12, it says, death spread to all mankind, the last part of it, because all sinned. Not because we are in Adam, but because we sinned. Adam's sin spreads, death spreads, because we sin. Now, that's a profound difference, what it actually says and what Augustine's mistranslation said. So we have now what we're aiming at is trying to understand Augustine's third explanation. He said we were in Adam when he sinned, and I'm showing you that that was a mistranslation. So we're going to take a quicker look in the next slide at this passage, Romans 5:12, and look more carefully. What does it actually say? Because there's actually 3 steps in this verse, and I'm going to put up a diagram to show us the first step. So here again is this verse, and I've underlined step number 1. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world. Okay, step 1, Adam's sin came into the world. Now, Augustine and others who follow in his way of thinking say sin came into the world. They define the world as humanity. Sin came into humanity. It doesn't say humanity, though. The Greek word there is cosmos. Nowhere in the Bible is the word cosmos used to refer to humanity. But Augustine and others who follow in his footsteps take that and say, well, here it means humanity. I want to propose to you that it doesn't. For example, in Romans, which this verse is taken from Romans, but you go to chapter 5, and it talks about that all of creation and all of the world, all of the cosmos, it literally was subject to corruption because of Adam's sin. It's the world itself. It doesn't say humanity. It says the world itself. I want to propose to you that if we take step number 1, what it actually says, it doesn't say Adam sinned and sin came into humanity. It says Adam sinned and came into the world. We live in the world. The Apostle John wrote how in the world is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. That there is something in this world that is now corrupt, and we live in a corrupt world. So I want to develop that concept, but we're trying to take this and focus on Romans 5:12. What does it actually say? It doesn't say sin entered humanity. It says sin entered the world. Let's look at the next slide and take the next step. So I'm jumping ahead right here, trying to find the right one. And here we have step 2. So we're still reading that verse. We identified step 1. Now I have underlined the next important phrase, and death through sin. So what that verse is saying is when Adam sinned, sin came into the world. Then death came through sin. So as sin is in the world, it is now a doorway for death to come into this world. Now, we know Adam and Eve were subject to sin and death. This word death, though, I want to take a minute to define it. You see, in Western civilization, we tend to think of death as an event. You die, you stop breathing, you're down. In reality, in Bible terms, the people to whom the Bible was originally written, they understood death differently. They saw death as the opposite of life. And just take a minute for this. Life is a process, not an event. It's a process that ends an event. Like if you become saved, a Christian, you put your faith in Jesus, Jesus said you will have life and life more abundantly. But not only will you start living in life abundantly, but at the end of this road, if you're a believer in Jesus, you will see Jesus, who is life and light. And when you see him, you'll be transformed into his image. You will be the totality of life. There'll be no more death left in you. Life is seen as a process ending in the fullness of life for those who are saved. Death, to these people also, it was seen as the opposite of life, that it's a process ending in the totality of death. Just to help us understand this, back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, when God said to Adam and Eve, "In the day you eat of it, you will die." Well, that's a common translation, "you will die." Actually, the original Hebrew doesn't say to Adam and Eve, "you'll die." It says, "dying, you will die." That's what the Hebrew literally says, dying, which is an ongoing process, you will die. Meaning that if you eat of that tree, you'll be sentenced to death, you'll suffer the consequences, and then you will die. They didn't die that day. No, they suffered death. So what is death? In here, this is taken from Romans 5:12. Well, in chapter 6, the next chapter, Paul, writing, defines it. He says, the wages of sin is death. That means the consequences of sin is death. What was Paul referring to, death? Death is the consequences of sin. All the bad stuff in the world that came into the world because of sin, which includes shame and guilt and broken relationships and sickness and poverty, war, strife, all of the bad stuff that came into the world because of sin. Those are the wages of sin. Those are the consequences of sin. To the people who this was first written to, they understood death as all the consequences of sin, which end in a final death. That death is a process, but it ends in the fatality. To dust you will return. When this says, now Romans 5:12, just as through one man sin entered in the world, and then through sin came death. He's talking about there came into the world guilt and shame and sickness and poverty and brokenness and strife and all the stuff you experience in this world. It came into the world through sin. Now, we're going to go to the third step in this verse, and it says, after it says death through sin, so death spread to all mankind. So step 3 is this death spread to humanity. All of humanity experiences this consequence of sin, which is shame and guilt and poverty and brokenness and all the stuff, bad stuff in the world. We experience it, all of humanity. It spreads to them. Now, finally, why does it spread to them? The last phrase, because all sin. Okay, it doesn't say because we're in Adam. The reason this sin and death spreads to us is because all sin. Now I'm going to put this in one package, what we've just learned. And this next slide, notice I've put just one diagram, and I'm showing sin and death reign over humanity. Ever since Adam sinned, sin and death came into the world, and now it reigns over humanity. If you keep reading in Romans 5, you can pick out these where it says death reigned, sin reigned, and death. So when Adam and Eve sinned, sin came in, and people fell. There was a fall. The fall of humanity, we fell under the power of sin and death. Sin and death reigns over us now. And Paul goes on in Romans chapter 7 and says, now there is a law of sin and death. In Romans chapter 8, there's a law of sin and death. It's like the law of gravity. Everybody is under this corruption. We all experience it. But we still now want to talk about how then does sin get into us? If it's in the world reigning over us, how then does it enter us? Because I am saying Augustine's 3 explanations, covenant, sin, or in Adam, none of them explain it. They're all, you have to say, you see, in debates and logic, people who aren't studying debates and logic probably aren't aware of this, but someone who has thought about debates and logic realizes that someone who doesn't have a good argument will give 3 or 4 arguments, hoping one will stick. Augustine gave 3 arguments None of them stick. But if you give enough arguments, it confuses the other person, and they don't take the time to look at each of the 3 or 4, however many they're giving out, and they can overwhelm you. But anyone who understands says, oh, they're giving lots of arguments because none of them is reasonable. That's why you would give many arguments. If there was one argument that was real, they would stick with one argument. That's what's real. None of Augustine's 3 explanations work. So now I'm going to go to the next slide because we're still developing this understanding, sin, death. So now we ask the question, how then does sin get into somebody? How does sin get in? Sin is in the world, is ruling over us. Death is in the world. I quote Genesis 4:7 to talk about when God spoke to Cain. So Adam and Eve, his parents, had sinned. Sin and death was in the world. Did sin come into Cain because of Adam and Eve's sin? No. This is what God said. And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door and it desires for you, but you must master it. Okay, God didn't say sin is in you, Cain, because your parents sinned. He's saying, no, sin is lurking at the door. It's wanting to come into you. Sin has some influence, some authority, because we have fallen under its power. Paul says in Romans chapter 7, sin is at work in the members of my body. It's outside of me, working on me. But how does it enter a person? That's what James explains. So I quote now James 1:14-15, but each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. And when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. Okay, this is another one of those things that has steps to it. Each one is tempted that you have a desire for something and you're getting pulled down a path. This desire that you have is now pulling you in a direction towards something when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Now, this desire that's tempting you, pulling on you, when you get carried away, when you lose control, when now it's leading somewhere where you know you shouldn't go, it has now, we can turn the thought desire into lust. It now has become a lust that is such a strong desire. It's pulling you down a path towards sin. And then it says, when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. Okay, so the lust that's within you, the desire that becomes uncontrollable, you want it, and lust conceives. That is the imagery of a woman conceiving within herself. It's a woman who conceives a baby, but she brings something from outside of her inside of her. The sperm and the egg come in contact, and sin is born. So the imagery of the woman is the imagery used here. You and I, we lust for something. When we get carried away with it, it literally is conceived in us. It joins the desire, that which is from outside joins with what's inside, and sin is born in us. How does sin come into us? Through our lust, through repeatedly desiring things that we're not supposed to. So here is the process by which the sin that's in the world comes in. Now, this is our last slide here, and I want to just talk about some implications. There's many more implications in the textbook. I hope you get it. But here, quickly, point number 1, people are not all equally evil. Now, this is important because with Augustine's thinking, everyone's bent. Everyone inherits the same evilness from Adam. If every human being inherits the same evilness, they're all equally evil. That tends to lead one to the idea that people are totally depraved. Because if you're bent, every part of you is bent. Everything is bent in you. Nothing is straight. Bent is bent. You're either bent or straight. Well, Augustine understood that everyone is bent, and that led, the next step. Augustine would describe babies born radically selfish. Calvin would say babies are totally depraved. People are not all equally evil. Why? Because sin came into the world, and how you become evil is by desiring. And so different people have been swooed by different desires and lusts. They bring it within themselves. Number 2, babies that die do not go to hell. See, this is one of the implications of Augustine's thought. If every baby is born totally, evil, then they deserve to go to hell. Now, the next point kind of expounds upon this. Babies are not evil. Augustine wrote, each man being derived from a condemned stock is first of all born of Adam, evil and carnal. Every person is born evil and carnal. That's the conclusion of Augustine's view. Now, if the conclusion is wrong, there's something assumed early on in the thought process that's wrong. And that's why I'm saying all of this is built on Plotinus's concept of God, radiating his attributes, then defining sin as the bending of God's will. Neither of those come from the Bible. The bending of God's will, that's not a definition of in the Bible. I clearly define it in the text, but I'm trying to show you the difference between building on the classical view versus the biblical view. Augustine has to conclude. John Calvin, remember, he builds on Augustine's theology. What did he write about babies? Their whole nature is a seed of sin, hence it can only be hateful and abhorrent to God. According to Calvin, babies are abhorrent. He hates babies. And that's unavoidable because they're evil to the core of their being. I'd propose to you that that's not what the Bible teaches. Here I put, these are Jesus' words. Yes, have you never read from the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself? I mean, how can babies, nursing infants, have a praise for God coming out of them? Okay, if they're totally evil, if they're totally abhorrent to God, they can't. Here's another one. Jesus said, let the children alone and do not hinder them for coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. There's something about children, an innocence that allows them to accept the kingdom easily, to believe. There's an innocence about them. And this is the best one. Jesus said, see that you do not despise these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. Now, think of that. The disciples are trying to keep the children away from Jesus. Jesus said, don't forbid the children. Let them come to me because their angels are beholding the face of the Father. Think about that. Every baby comes into this world with an angel. And the angel assigned to that baby is right now always looking in the face of God the Father. There's a divine connection between the angel and the Father, but there's an association of that angel with the baby. And Jesus was saying to his disciples, be careful how you treat these children, because their angels are beholding the face of the Father. There's some divine connection. A baby comes into this world with some divine connection to God. So how do you look at a newborn baby? Do you see it as Augustine and Calvin did? This thing is abhorrent to God. This is totally evil, and God hates this baby. Or when you look in the face of a baby, say, this baby has a direct connection to God. There's something about it where God's presence, his innocence is there, and it is giving praise to God by its very nature. Thou hast prepared praise for thyself in the baby and the nursing infant. Okay. 4, the sins of the parents do not automatically go to 3 or 4 generations. Instead, sins come upon 3 or 4 generations of those who hate me. Now, this is an important distinction because if you read this next verse, Exodus 20, verse 5, through Augustine's eyes, you're going to think this is reinforcing the idea that sins of parents come into their children. But you'll conclude something different if you're not following Augustine's foundation. You quote, you shall not worship them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, inflicting the punishment of the fathers on the children, on the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me. Notice that last phrase, of those who hate me. The sins of parents do not come upon children, their descendants, unless those descendants hate them. You see, if you and I get angry at God, we might not even be aware of it. You start thinking life is unfair, and subconsciously, maybe deeper level, you're thinking, God, why are you putting me all these problems on me? If you get that in your heart, somehow the sins of your parents start coming upon you, not in you, says the sins will come upon you. They start tempting you. They start becoming in your consciousness, you really feel. Sins of parents cannot come directly into them. Someone has to open their heart. And when you open your heart and start being angry at God, then the sin tendencies of parents can actually influence you. Number 5, there are generational weaknesses, not generational sins. Okay, we in our Christianity often talk about generational sins, but we're implying that sins come into the nature of the descendants, and that's not true. No, that's why a shift in our terminology helps, because people do inherit weaknesses. Some parents have a tendency for anger or alcoholism. The weaknesses can be passed on, but sins are never passed on. Sins can come upon you, but you have to open up your heart before they'll enter you. And finally, point 6, people are responsible for their sins. You see, with Augustine's thoughts that everyone is born bent, they're actually not responsible for their sins because they got bent. They're born bent. It's their makeup. They can't help but sin. So in one sense, they're not responsible. You could say, well, they're responsible in one sense because simply they're sinners, yes. But in another sense, they're not responsible because that's the way they were born. On the other hand, if you become sinful because you open your heart to the sin that's in the world, then you are responsible for your sins. That's a huge difference. Now, there are many other implications of what we're teaching. We've just hit some of the headings. If you'd like to read the textbook, I encourage you to go to the website, FatherSonTheology.com. There's more videos there, teachings, things available for you. But also, if you really want to understand this clearly, please read the textbook. This is volume 5 in the 12-volume series. Thanks for listening. God bless you.